right, let's get started. So we're going to pick up where we left off. Now, today we're going to look at querying. However, there were some topics that go along with. Give everybody a chance to get settled. There were some topics from the initial set of Access slides, and there were things I haven't covered yet, and I want to let you know that I haven't forgotten about those. A couple of the things that we are going to go back and look at as we begin to go through querying have to do with some of the database design. You guys ready? So some of the database design stuff. When you're looking at creating your tables and your fields, there are going to be some things that you really need to pay attention to. However, a lot of it really makes no sense until we start looking at the fine-tuning of queries. And so once we look at queries and we do some of the, really the intense stuff with setting up some of the criteria, then we're going to go back and we're going to look at some of the more of the design elements, also reporting. We looked at tables and queries. I showed you how to create a quick form, but we haven't covered reports. We haven't done that yet because those go hand in hand with queries. It makes more sense to show that to you after we have looked at creating queries. So we are going to go back to some of this stuff. So we're going to start out today talking about querying in Access. And for this, we're going to be starting on page 118 in the slides. Now we'll continue to look at that research papers database to look at some of the examples of the queries. I think it's one thing to be able to watch the slides, talk about how to query and how to use the design view and the QBE grid, but to literally go into Access and watch what's happening, I think that's going to be something that's also important. So I will go back and forth between Access and the PowerPoint presentation. It'll hopefully give you a good sense of what's going on. It's really, at this point in the semester, people tend to get a little anxious about the class. And I do want to address that the best way that you can get over some of what might feel like just a really abstract sort of nature of Access would be to begin working on the pre-lab, and this is the pre-lab that's due when you come back from break, to begin working on that as soon as possible. I would even suggest working on it before spring break. And that will give you the opportunity to take some of the material that you're learning here in class, get your hands on Access, and then as you're moving through some of these mechanical steps, you can see what you're doing and connect with why you're doing it. So the book can do a really good job of telling you where to go to do things in Access, but to make sure that you understand why you're doing it, that's what we pulled together here in lecture. So today we'll be looking at using the query design tool, and we'll be looking at different reasons for using this. So we can look at filtering out data, we can look at sorting by various fields in a query. We'll look at aggregating fields to summarize results. We'll also look at performing some calculations. And all of these are combined into querying, and what will make this more complicated as we continue on will be times when we have to run queries and we need to pull data from 2 tables, 3 tables, 4 tables. The more tables that you pull into your queries, the more complicated things become, and there are a lot of behind-the-scenes things that go on in Access that can really jeopardize the integrity of your results. And those are things that we're going to learn all along the way. So what is a query? A query is really just a question. And in Access, there's a specific tool to use in order to ask a question in Access. So the research papers database that we've been looking at allows us to go in, once we have all these thousands of clients in the database and thousands of transactions of papers that have been dropped off and charges because of the papers that were typed up and the payments that were made. Once we have those thousands, maybe tens of thousands of entries in there, we may want to get a snapshot of just some of the data that exists. So maybe we want to see the last names, the first names, the client ID that corresponds to people who have made payments between certain dates. We don't want to have to download the entire client and payment tables and look at that ourselves and pull that out. We want to have a systematic way to do this, and the only way to do it is to use the query design tool and to be able to learn to speak Access language. Now, when you run a query in Access, you're using a very user-friendly graphical user interface, also known as a GUI, G-U-I. graphical user interface. You're able to click and drag and move things into particular slots within the QBE grid and tell Access with that method, hey, this is what I want as my query result to go do this. Behind the scenes, what Access does is it takes those steps that you perform and it translates it into what's called SQL, or Structured Query Language. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a little bit. The nice thing is, that's not really what you have to learn to use Access. So when we're asking questions, and we want to see just snapshots of the database and the data that exists within the database, by asking for maybe payments that were made between dates, the date itself becomes a condition field, a field that has a restriction based on it. So conditions are relational expressions. I'm going to kind of work this backwards because to me it makes more sense that way. A condition is a relational expression involving exactly one field. When you put multiple conditions together, they become criterion. And criterion are expressions that tell your database management system which records you want to retrieve from the database. Now, the example that we have written below is an example of a criterion that has two separate conditions with it. So if we had a database that had products, inventory that we sold, and we wanted to pull out information about just those products that were in a particular category, and here the categories might be designated as letters, BE, and also had a certain number of units in stock, that would be an example of a criterion that had two separate conditions. So as we move forward, we're going to be looking at using the query by example grid, QBE grid, that object-oriented user interface that we have to create the queries. And then behind the scenes, what's going to happen? Down below, you can see a picture of the structured query language. That's what Access is going to translate what you're saying into the language it reads. So we're going to look at this database, and it's important. When we were looking at the in-class exercise, I said to you that it's important that you always look for your primary keys first, and then identify your foreign key fields, or the relationship fields after that. The database that we're going to be querying on, it's important for us to do the same thing here. So before you ever start to write queries, it's important that you know what your database is, what it's keeping track of, how each table is set up, and how the tables interact with each other, how they're related. Bless you. The reason for this, and you've seen me show you an example of what happens when you don't do this, if you have to run a query where you need to use two tables together to get the results, you put those two tables up in the design view window, and there's no line between them, no relationship between them, you get really screwy results. So if you haven't identified in your database where your primary keys are and where your foreign keys are, you can fully expect to get some really weird query results. So let's look at this again. This was the research papers database. We had a table that kept track of the clients who bring in their papers. We kept track of the charges, or the papers, basically, that we typed for them. We didn't write them, we typed them. We keep track of the payments that the clients made in a separate table. So clients table, charges table, payments table, and then a table called payment methods. So these are the four tables we're going to work with. Primary key fields, we had one in the client table, and that's client ID. We had a primary key field in the payment method table, and that's method ID. Charges table, no primary key field. Payments table, no primary key field. And hopefully this isn't news to you. We've seen this before. We saw this in the last set of lecture slides. There was a relationship between client and payments based on the field client ID. Where was the primary key side of that relationship? In the relationship between the client table and the payments table, based on the field client ID, where was the one side of that relationship? What does the one side even mean? What's the one side mean? You guys can't be brain dead yet. Spring break isn't here. Over here. Yeah, the one side of the relationship is the primary key side of the relationship. You guys can't quit out on me yet. Primary key side of the relationship, the one side of the relationship is where the field that's in common, that foreign key field where it's unique, where each entry shows up once and only once. That's what the one means. One means unique. The one side is the primary key side. The many side is the side that isn't primary. and I mentioned this last time, the relationship field itself is frequently called the foreign key field, but also you will hear the term foreign key used to refer to the many side of the relationship. So foreign key corresponds to or refers to the relationship. You'll also sometimes hear people say the foreign key side of the relationship is the many side of the relationship. Now, it is possible sometimes to have relationships where the primary key side of the relationship is both sides. You can't have a one-to-one relationship. You can never have a legitimate many-to-many relationship. So if you have two tables in a relationship and both sides are many symbols or infinity symbols, that's not a real relationship. So at least one of the sides has to be unique, has to be a primary key field. I got to hide something for a second. I made a change this morning with the earlier class, and I don't want you to see it. All right, there we go. So it is possible to have a one-to-one relationship, but they are very, very rare. They're uncommon, and later on with some of the additional practice problems, we'll look at why they're uncommon. Why am I seeing the one of the many symbols showing up on this relationship? How did that happen? Because I can see it here. I don't see it here. Back here. One more time. I did. I signified in the client table that client ID was the primary key. But what's odd is between payment method and payments, I did indicate which field was primary here, didn't I? You see a key showing up next to method ID, right? So why don't I see the one and the many showing up here? Why am I seeing it here but not here? Yes? No, it's not because method ID isn't in the payments table. We'll look at the tables real quick just so you can see this. I think it's more obvious between client and charges and client and payments that the relationship is based on the client ID field because the field's named the same in both tables. Whereas here, the field isn't named the same thing. The field that we're joining on, that relationship field, is called method ID in the payment method, and it's called payment type over in the payments table. So let's take a look at what that means. So here's payment method. That's the table payment method. Method ID corresponds to an ID that's been given to the way in which the payment was made. And the payments table, payment type, really is the same field as method ID. It's just that somebody gave it a different name. So the two fields are the same, and there is a relationship between them. And Access doesn't get too hung up on the names of the fields. And I said this is the primary key site, but why isn't it putting the one and the many symbols on the relationship here at the end? Yes? Yes, I haven't enforced referential data integrity, or RDI, that great big term we learned last time. I did not enforce referential data integrity. Oh, darn it, I got to make one more change. All right. So let's go in and enforce referential data integrity. Whoa. I think Access just told me to go to hell. It says Microsoft Access can't create the relationship and enforce referential data integrity. I wanted to enforce RDI, and Access said, no way. Why? Come on, why? Over here. The other boxes checked? You think that might have helped? Perhaps the concern might be these two boxes are checked. Nope, Hunter. Yeah, I already have a violation of RDI in the many side of this relationship. And it may be hard to read, but this is what the beginning part of that error message says. Data in the table payments violates referential integrity rules. So if I take a look at the data that exists, so here is payment method, and I have methods 1 through 5 defined, and I open up the payments table, and lo and behold, well, there's an entry of 6. We don't even know what that is. What is 6? Somebody paying chewing gum? Trident layers? We don't have that payment method. That's a violation. And in the in-class exercise, it was referred to as an orphan. It kind of pulls at your heartstrings. It's an orphan record. It's a record that's existing over in the many side of the relationship that has no home, no parent over in the primary key side of the relationship. Either way, this is a problem. That's why we can't enforce RDI. So it looks like, well, somebody just typed in the wrong payment method. At least we hope it is. The problem is, depending upon when you finally decide to enforce RDI in your database, if you don't do this after the relationships have been set, but before anybody populates the tables, if you wait, by the time you want to go in to enforce RDI, odds are there will be numerous violations of RDI. And later on, when we cover access, I can show you very, very simple ways of going in and easily just pulling out those entries that represent violations of RDI. Finding them is nothing. Fixing them is what takes a lot of time. Well, I'm going to go in and fix this one. We're going to assume that it was supposed to be an entry of 5. We'll close that. And if our theory was right about what caused this problem, then when we try to go back in and enforce RDI, we should not have any problem. So yeah, the one of the many symbols show up after you enforce RDI. Enforcing RDI also is a great way to have Excel go in and double check the validity of your foreign key field. Early on, remember, I set up a query with 2 tables, and I deleted out the relationship. And when I set up relationships, I think the first day we looked at relationships, I even set up a bogus relationship. I dragged and dropped the field over the wrong field. And Access didn't even get mad. They just said, okay, fine, whatever, we're going to go with that. So when you enforce RDI, if you have accidentally set up a bad relationship, Access, if there's going to be any chance at all that Access is going to be able to figure this out, this is where Access would recognize it and tell you you've got a problem. Okay, so let's take a look at the relationship between client and charges and also between client and payment. So for a little bit, let's get rid of the methods table, okay? You can see that I have RDI enforced between the 2 sets of tables. I have cascade update and cascade delete enforced here. And I also have it enforced. It's also a good idea to make sure you have the relationship selected before you double click, or you can see what happens. Let's say, for example, that this second relationship, let's say I just enforce RDI, but not cascade update, not cascade delete. Well, let's start small. I was actually going to ask you a really big question, but let's get this table out of the picture just for a minute. So I only have cascade or referential data integrity enforced here, not cascade update, not cascade delete. And let's say, for example, I have a client ID for one of my clients in the client table, and they don't like the number I gave them. For whatever reason, that really long number is bad luck to them, and they want their ID changed. And I go in, and I try to change the client ID from the client table. Well, first of all, would Access allow me to do that? And if it does, what would it do with the corresponding table? So I have enforced RDI, but not cascade update. Will Access allow me to change a client ID to something different over in the client table? What would happen if I did set up and enforce RDI and cascade update? Would Access allow me to make the change in the client table? Yes. Yeah, because it's the primary key site. So if I enforce RDI and cascade update, and I try to change a client ID in the client table, Access will allow me to do that, and it will also go in and make any corresponding changes to that same client ID in the payments table. So what if I enforce only RDI but not cascade update? Then what would happen? it wouldn't update it. Would it allow me to make the change at all? So I make the change. Let's think about this for a second. Let's see, I change the client ID to all zeros. And what maybe before that it was all ones. And there are entries in the payments table of all ones. I've told Access, yeah, go ahead and change that client ID in the client table to all zeros, but don't update that in the payments table. So what will happen then? What would those entries of all ones in the payments table be? Violations of RDI. Yeah, if I tell Access, enforce referential data integrity, but don't update any changes, then by changing the entry that was all ones to all zeros and not updating that in the payments table, I instantly have violations of RDI. So if I enforce RDI but not cascade update, Access wouldn't even allow me to make a change to the client ID in the clients table. So now let's add in that third table that has its own relationship with the client table. Because we think about RDI as really only being affected by each individual relationship, and it can get bigger than that. To get payments, we need charges. So here I said I did it again. I did enforce RDI and cascade update and cascade delete. And so if I were to change a client ID in the client table, I'm telling Access that, yes, you may go in and update it in the charges table. But I'm saying you can't do that in the payments table. So now, if I try to go in and change a client ID in the clients table that used to be all ones, and I try to change it to all zeros, will Access allow me to do it? I'm looking at the same exact relationship. I've just got another relationship added in here, right? Between these two tables, I've told Access, yeah, update the changes. Between these two, I've said don't. And so when I try to go in and change a client ID in the clients table, I can't do it. I can't do it because the client table is connected to another table where I've told Access it may not update the changes, even though it can update the changes over here. Since it can't update the changes here, and it's connected to the payments table with the same foreign key field that connects it to the charges table, it's really the relationship that is the most limited relationship that defines what Access can do with any relationship based off of the client ID field. Questions so far? All right, so this is the database that we'll be looking at. So our first set of queries. Construct a query to list your clients by first name and last name. Doesn't seem like much of a query, does it? Just want to see the first name and last name. I don't want to see just those customers who live in Columbus. I'm not restricting anything. I just want to look at only two fields. So the beginning steps of this query include figuring out which tables you need. To get first name and last name, well, we just need the client table. And I'll pull this up a little bit. Now, if something should happen, and when you go to run a query, you didn't realize that there was another table that you needed, you can right-click anywhere in the design view window, which is the top portion of this query design area, and select Show Table. And that will allow you to pull in an additional table if you need it. And let's say you have two tables in your query design view and you realize you don't need them both. You can simply right-click the table or tables you don't need and remove them. So you don't have to start from scratch when you don't have the right tables up here. So the query asks for first name and last name. I'm just double-clicking the field names, and they pop into the next available spot in the QBE grid. I run the query, and I see the results. So when I run the query, this is called the Dynaset, D-Y-N-A-S-E-T, Dynaset. It's also called query results. So these are the query results. If it turns out I need to make a change, I can go back into the design view and make a change. Perhaps I want to change up the order of the fields. If you click above the fields in the QBE grid, you can completely select it, and then you can click it and drag it. You can reverse the order of the fields. You can also select the field and hit delete and get rid of it. Something that we'll get into a little bit later in today's class, because it's not quite so simple as I'm about to show you, if you wanted to sort by a particular field. So for example, I want to sort the last names in alphabetical order. I can click on the sort line, and I get three options: ascending, descending, and not sorted. If I don't want to sort a field, I don't have to click not sorted. It just goes back to being a blank area. So only pick this if you do want to sort a field. So now I rerun the results, and I see that the last names are arranged in alphabetical order. Now, the toggle button at the top that takes us back and forth between the design view and the Dynaset, if you click on the arrow underneath it, one of the options that's available is SQL view. If you pick that, that will show you the structured query language view, or what the syntax is that Access converted your example into. This is the SQL for the query that we just ran. So let's say I close this query out. I'm going to just name it names. When you see the query name called names, what's being saved here? When I double click on this, what's being saved? Is it this? Or is it this? Is it the results or the instructions, or both? Which is it? Yeah. It's the instructions. Why? Yeah. And it's not even a matter of if you, he said if you were to update something about the table clients, it would automatically be, those changes would be updated in the query the next time you ran it. And it's not even a matter of if you update the query, it's a matter of how much you, or the table, it's a matter of how much you update the table. So at the bottom it said, what happens if you change the last name of John Smith to Jones and you rerun the query? Well, next time you run the query, John Smith's last name is going to be Jones. So it's a way of showing the most up-to-date content of the tables upon which the query was based, but it's also a way of saving space. If you run a query and every time you save it, you're saving the results, that will quickly consume much of the space in your database. So here we begin a series of slides where you have to kind of fill in the blanks. And we didn't do this because we just want to keep you busy. Well, maybe we did a little bit. Sometimes when you stay a little bit busy, you also stay a little bit more awake. But this gives you something to be a bit more interactive in what we're doing. So you're going to be filling in some of these QBE grids yourself. And you're going to be doing it while I show you. So it's not like you're going to be figuring this out on your own without anybody having instructed you. So the next query that you have to run asks you to include the first name and last name for all of the clients who live in Ohio. Where's the attendance sheet at right now? So we can pretty much keep up what we just had in terms of the basics of this query. So I needed last name, I needed first name, and I then wanted to make sure that the only last names and first names that are returned in this query are those for people who live in Ohio. In order for us to include a restriction based on the state, well, we have to include the state field in the QBE grid. So I have included now state in the third slot. It doesn't matter what order these fields are in. I could put state first name second, last name third. It doesn't matter. There's really only going to be one situation where the order of the fields in the grid matters, and I will tell you that. That way you don't miss that. So with the restriction of Ohio, I would, on the criteria line, notice, let's get rid of this navigation pane. Along the side of this QBE grid, we have criteria, and then we have or, and then we have nothing. So underneath the or that you see, each one of these lines underneath it is an implied or statement. So we're going to be using the or and any implied ors underneath this to build more complex types of queries where we have multiple conditions where at least one of the conditions has to be met. And we're going to talk about this more as we go through it. But just so that you know a bit more about what's going on the side of the grid. So underneath state, I'm going to type in my criteria. Ohio. Well, that's odd. Nothing happened. Don't we have some people from Ohio in our database? I think we do. OH. I-O. I was waiting for that. Well, yeah, I'm asking for people from Ohio, but I didn't ask it the way in which the client table was set up to have that state field entered. It's a two-letter abbreviation. This is one of the things that is an example of why it's so important to make sure that you've looked at the data in your database before you start querying. So it is a two-letter abbreviation. When I click off of that criteria line, Access is sticking in quotes around the criteria for me. It takes OH and puts it in quotes. Access for our queries is not case sensitive, so it doesn't matter if I put the letters uppercase, lowercase, one of each, it doesn't matter. But Access recognizes that state is a text field, and so the criteria in that field is text criteria. So it puts the quotes in for me. Now I run the query, and I see that, now I do have some results. Now, we had gone in initially when we set up this database. If I go back into the client table, we made it a little bit difficult for people to have much freedom in how they entered in a state. If I were to click and start entering in OHIO, I would be cut off after 2 letters. And so I would know I can't put in more than 2 letters. And that would standardize the entries for me. But if I didn't do that, and I didn't set that there were only 2 characters that were allowed, and I didn't force people into one way of putting in a state, that's really going to change how I have to write my criteria, isn't it? I have to worry about people who entered in just OH, people who entered in OHIO, people who misspelled Ohio because they were typing too fast. And lo and behold, if we have to search for another state like Wisconsin, God only knows how many different ways somebody could misspell it. So when we don't standardize the options, when we write our queries, when we make sure we get everybody who's from Ohio, we have to write a query that takes into consideration all the ways in which that state name could have been spelled. And that would be a nightmare. It's important for you to keep that in mind. Now, what do you think's going on here? I'm messing around with the client table, and I also have a query open in the background, and Access is getting mad at me. It's saying, you can't make a change anywhere. Anybody know why? Well, these 2 items are dependent upon each other. So any change that I make to the table can't be saved because a query that's based on that table is open and in the works. So Access makes me commit to one of them and close the other one out before I can do anything. So that's one thing that you'll notice if you have lots of things open while you're trying to run your queries. So let's think about this for a minute. We look at having to write a criteria that's based on the state. Where's the attendance sheet at now? Let's move that as quickly as possible. I'll tell you why in a minute. Let's go back and look at one of these design examples. So this has to do with how you figure out the fields that you create. So when you're creating your own tables in Access, well, you got a lot of leeway in what you do. One example of leeway, notice with the line that says divide tables into inseparable fields. And underneath that, it says an address as one field. An address is one field where address means your house number, your street name, the suffix of the street, city, state, zip code, all in one field. That's an option for you, isn't it? Well, so is creating a name field where it is implied that you put in last name, comma, space first name, and then a middle initial, all in one field. How do you figure out what you want to do with your options? And these are just a couple of the different options you might have. Stay with me. Imagine that you're thinking ahead now because you've looked at a couple of queries and you realize if you have a restriction that's based on the city, and you have your address field set up as one very big field, like we see in the first example. So the example being someone who lives in New York City in New York State. If I need to write a query where I restrict so that I only get those residents of New York City, how do I write a query if my address field is one huge field with city, state, zip code combined, and tell Access I want to see just the people from New York City, but not necessarily everybody from New York State? Writing that kind of query would require a little bit of talent. So when you're setting up your fields in a table, you want to break things down into the smallest reasonable unit. When I say reasonable, that doesn't mean for a name field you want to have first letter of your first name, second letter of your first name, third letter. That's not a reasonable unit. But the entity of just the first name, as opposed to a name field that contains first, last, and the middle initial, that would be something where a separable unit would be last name for one field, first name for another, and then middle initial if you need it. And the whole point of this is to make querying easier and more reliable. All right, so let's pick out some additional queries. We've run just a couple of really basic ones. Wildcards. Wildcards are symbols that can be used in our querying that represent other characters, and this adds a lot of flexibility into our querying. So if I wanted to be able to run a query and ask to see just those clients whose last name begin with the letter L, I don't have to go in and write a query that includes every single last name that begins with L. I can tell Access that I need entries that start with a particular letter, and by using one of these wildcard symbols, I can tell Access that it can include any other symbol after that, any number of symbols, even the absence of symbols or characters. So here we have the asterisk, and the asterisk replaces an infinite number of characters and even the absence of characters. So if I wanted to look for, and let's run a query that does this. Let's pull up just the client table again. And let's put client ID, first name and last name. And let's say I want to show all of the clients whose last names begin with the letter L. Now, one of the ways you might think to do this before you've ever learned about wildcard conditions, and I'm sticking an L on the criteria line under last name, and Access does some of what Excel did. It tries to help me out. So right now, Access is saying, hey, if you're trying to write a function, here are all the functions that start with the letter L, and I'm not interested in those. So I'm going to put just L under last name and hope that Access knows what I'm talking about. And I'm getting the impression Access didn't. Now, in all fairness, there can be times where you run a query and nothing shows up for your results. Sometimes the restrictions that you write, there may not be any records in your table or your tables, depending on how many you've used. There might not be any that meet your restrictions. But I believe there's somebody whose last name starts with the letter L. With the way in which I have written this query, what am I really asking Access for? What was that? Yeah, anybody whose last name is just L. That's not really what I meant to ask. So I can say L, asterisk. Now when I pop my cursor off this line, Access puts in some additional syntax for me. And this is also in the book, so you can see what's being placed in there. I know it's small. Some of you may have a hard time reading it. But around the L asterisk, Access put in the word like and put quotes in. Okay, so I'm going to take just a moment to explain something to you. This is extra credit and how what I'm going to need you to do. Sorry to make you get back up again. I need you to take a head count. And if you could just break it down by each row, that way it's easier to total up. So extra credit is going to be attendance, people who are in class and stay in class. It's very simple to take off and leave. I know you get bored, but being here is really important. And it's also going to be important, especially for those of you who didn't do as well on the midterm exam as you had hoped. So to try and help people to not have any motivation to leave early, there is sometimes, not all the time, there will sometimes be extra credit based on attendance. Now, it just so happens I did give extra credit this morning in the morning class, And I'm also going to do that this afternoon in this class, but it won't always be, morning class gets it, you guys get it. It will not always be like that. So you can't just assume that that's the case. So today, being here and signing in will be worth 4 points. I don't know that it will always be worth 4 points. I'm telling you today that if you sign in, it's worth 4 points. This is the easiest darn extra credit you could ever get. Sign next to your name, so you're basically just signing a second time. And let's do this as quickly as possible so that it can get through to everyone. I don't want people at the end of class having to stand in line to sign the attendance sheet. So please be vigilant that you see the attendance sheet and you move it on as fast as you can. There are a couple stipulations to this. Yes, it is an incredibly easy way to get extra credit. To me, this might show more motivation than anybody who's just looking for some busy work to sloppily turn in. But it has been abused in the past, and I'm not ignorant to that fact. So I do have the TA taking a head count. This also means if you cut out early, and you may think, she won't recognize me. I recognize a lot more of you than you think I do. So if you leave early, and I do recognize you, you have just waived your right to the points for that day. But secondly, we will count up the number of signatures that are on this list. And if the head count, and I'm going to have Hal double check his head count, if the number is different, then this doesn't count. And I won't do any additional extra credit this way. And this really has been abused. I have, in past semesters, past quarters, had attendance sheets side by side, and there were signatures that were not the same, brought students in and found out that it wasn't their signature. So I'm telling you, I know this happens. I don't want it to happen because I really like to continue giving extra credit this way. This is where you also have to have some responsibility for yourselves and for each other. If you notice someone signing 2 names on that attendance sheet and you let me know about it, then there's a chance that I will not just delete out that extra credit. So you need to be policing each other as well. You need to be getting just as mad about people trying to take points away from you. And when people are getting points they didn't earn, that changes the likelihood of a curve being needed for the class. So at the end of the semester, I'm looking at the overall distribution of scores to determine whether or not I need to curve the class. If there's a population, a percentage of the class who has obtained points that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten if they wouldn't have done something that they shouldn't have done, and that brings up the class average significantly, then the likelihood for everyone to get a curve is a lot less. So you need to be aware of this. It doesn't affect me at all. I don't get a grade in here. But it bothers me when I see students who work really hard who are affected by this. So you've got to police each other. Questions about that? Right, the person is asleep next to you. If you could just politely give them a nudge so they don't miss out on the extra credit. And you do have to be here to get this. So if you email me later and say, not that this applies to any of you, you guys were here, but if on another day you email and say, I was really there, I remember what you were wearing and what you said, yeah, I can't do anything about that. You have to be here. All right, so now I run the query. I bet you were dying to see these results. You were just waiting for me to stop talking about the attendance. Oh, maybe I really didn't have anybody with the last name that began with L. Well, let's try S. Yeah, I do. I have some S's there. All right, so we'll try this again with an S so that you know I'm not just messing around. So if we just place an S for last name, we run the query, we get no results. We put in S star, which means the entry would have to start with the letter S, but it can have any characters after it. And if it just so happens that somebody's last name is just S, the asterisk also can replace the absence of characters. So that would also be returned in our results should that happen. So S asterisk, access sticks the like and the quotes in around our restriction, run the query. Now it means, hey, anything that starts with an S. I can use multiple asterisks if I want. I can put an asterisk before and after the S, which means anybody whose last name has the word S anywhere in it. So far, so good? Now, the question mark also is a wildcard symbol, but it's not nearly as flexible. The question mark replaces just one character and not the absence of characters. So if you're trying to write a condition in and you need for a particular character or characters to absolutely be there, and only one other character of flexibility, you would use the question mark to represent that. And it would work in much the same way when you click out of the line, Access puts in like in quotes to help with the terminology and the syntax of that condition. So if we needed to look for anyone by first name and last name that has an area code starting with 614, let's go in and do that. Let's take out a restriction based on last name. We'll take out client ID, and we will put in home phone. So if I just simply put in 614, that doesn't mean anything that starts with 614. That just means literally their phone number is 614. So 614 asterisk, and then Access sticks the like and the quotes in. Now, anybody have a problem with what we're seeing with our results? Because I see an open parenthesis, 614, and then a close parenthesis. And I did not put that in my syntax for my criteria, did I? Anybody know what's going on here? I didn't have to put 614 in parentheses and put the asterisk after it. Hunter? I had a rule. I had an input mask. And an input mask that automatically put in the parentheses around the area code when we typed in the phone number. And this was from a couple of classes ago. That input mask was a format that kind of sat over the top of any of the entries that got placed in home phone. The parentheses are not a part of the entry at all. It's a part of a mask or a template upon which all these entries have been placed. So the parentheses really aren't technically in that entry. And that's why they're not a part of the criteria that we had to write. That was a good answer. Now, what about people who don't live in an area with the starting 614? How would we change that query? Well, one of the ways that we could do it would be to go in and write all of the area codes we do want to see and make sure we don't put 614 asterisks in there, right? And if we have 15 different area codes, we have to make sure that we place them all in this query. That would be pretty crazy, especially considering that eventually we may have clients who are from area codes that weren't written into this query. So if we tried to list all of the area codes we do want to see, avoiding 614 because we don't want to see it, that's doomed to fail over time. How could I change this? Come on. We could put a not in front of it. I am really hoping that after next week, you guys all get that week off. You can kind of vegetate, get some relaxation, that you come back with some of the enthusiasm that you had a couple of classes ago. Because you all look like you're glazed over today. Is this a big midterm week? I always do this cautiously. I can't remember if I told you guys this, but I asked this at one time. Gosh, this must have been about 5 or 6 years ago. And the class just looked dead. And I said, oh, did I already tell you guys this story? I said, you guys look so tired. Is this a midterm week? How many of you have midterms? And a bunch of people raised their hands, and I heard somebody yell out, that's not it. We hate your class. So I'm always a little nervous about asking that. And actually what was funny about it was that you're all involuntary. Every single semester I teach this. Everybody kind of comes in feeling like, oh, do I have to take this class? So, I mean, I already knew that. But it was just kind of funny that somebody was just so tired they finally just said that. But yeah, that's why I start out the semester saying, I know you all are not here because you looked at the master schedule and said, oh, this class looks very interesting. I think I want to take it. I wish some people would do that, but they don't. So anyhow, we can add the not before our condition. And look at that. We get everything except for what we just saw in the last set of results. Pretty neat, huh? Yes. Yes, access will still put in, so let's put in not, and then we would put 614 asterisk, and access still puts in the like and the quotes around it. And so things like this, where access is putting the like and the quotes in, you wouldn't have to do on the test. Was that your question? I knew it. All right, so next set of slides. How many of you are already feeling like you like Access better than Excel? And of those of you who have your hands raised, how many of you had a really strong negative reaction towards Excel? Like you would really like to just throw the computer when Excel's open? How many of you who really liked Excel are really getting ticked off with Access? How many of you just really hate them both? No, not very many. All right, well, that's good. One of the things I had asked this morning's class, and I think it's only fair that I should ask you guys too, I have thought about, and we are exploring whether or not we should cover Access and then Excel. And we have some different reasons why, but I would like to get your feedback on what you think about us covering Access first and then Excel. I heard somebody say no in the back. Where are you? Who just said that? Is it with the gray shirt? I can't hear you. Come on, it's okay. No, I didn't say it. Who said it? Where are you? Oh my goodness, I think you're throwing your voice. It was coming from way in the back. Okay, why not? So he said, since more people are familiar with Excel than Access, it's nice to start off the semester with something you're familiar with. So there's that comfort level, and I'm kind of pulling you in a comfortable way. Did anybody of you feel like this semester was comfortable? Yeah? See, I can't tell from you guys. I look out onto a sea of faces, and I either see people who look like they want to throw something or people who look like they want to be on the beach. So this is good. Okay, so that comfort level, you think that's good to continue and kind of foster that. Because what I found was some complacence, and it worried me. Remember how many times I said, how many of you have looked at this assignment? And I'd see like 5 hands. I'd say, you guys are worrying me. Sometimes I worry that that's too much comfort, but you're saying, no, it doesn't feel like that. Well, I appreciate that, but I'm looking at other points. So especially those that don't agree with me, because I wouldn't be exploring other options if I didn't think there was some merit to it. Yeah. So she's saying the quotes and putting in the not, like the Boolean logical operators, and really, I know how much you've missed Boolean logic, and so I do have to tell you we've got more Boolean logic to pull into this. So that comfort that you had with Excel, you're going to see it here. But she's saying that's made it a bit easier to carry that over into Excel. Anybody else? Because if we covered Access first, then you'd learn it first in Access and you could carry it over to Excel. Not as much, though? Yeah.
Is it kind of even, like what companies use between Access and Excel?
It's not really even between what companies typically use between Excel and Access. You're more likely to be using Excel or some sort of spreadsheet software. But I don't want to make it sound like you're not using some form of a database, because I see that growing even faster over time. So what companies are using now will be different over time. So your ability to be able to work efficiently and effectively in a database is going to become more important as years go by. Yeah, it may not be Access, but most likely it'll be another relational database management system, and the concepts that you're learning here will be very pertinent. What else? No opinions one way or the other? We could just teach them both at the same time and you guys would be fine with it? Half semester class? Combine the two. Oh boy. Yeah. I'm thinking about how that would work. Yeah. So the thing that I have been concerned about, a lot of times you guys come in and at least 2/3 of you have covered Excel. And the sad reality is that people don't know what they don't yet know. So I have a lot of people who come in and they know Excel and they think they know all of Excel or they think they know a lot of Excel. And I lose them for a couple of weeks. They might be sitting way in the back. They might be up here, who knows. They're off in la-la land. They're texting. They're on their computers. And even though it feels very much like you can do all those things at one time, I lose you in there. So sometimes by the time people come back, I'm just way ahead of where they were in Excel. And so sometimes that comfort level with the software can be good, and sometimes it can be bad. And I've kind of wondered if maybe we just kind of throw you right into something that nobody's familiar with. You all are on the same playing field for the most part. You know, a lot of times if people come in and some people know Excel and some don't, the people who don't know Excel think they're just going to flunk because everybody else knows it. I mean, was anybody worried about that? You thought, well, everybody seems to know Excel, so they must know it better than I do. So the playing field's level, and we cover access, which most people haven't even touched. I don't know. Any other opinions on that? Yeah. So she's saying that if we start off with access, and she's saying she kind of likes access. You kind of feel like there's a comfort level there. Start off with something that would be more difficult, and then I think you said skate off with Excel off into the end of the semester, and then Excel is even easier than it might have been before because some of this syntactical stuff you're getting with access. And you guys have the chance to make a change in a couple, in the subsequent semesters. Yeah. Which program have I found that people think is more difficult? It's access, but I haven't really, and I don't have any research to back this up. I just have my own teaching experience for all these years. Sometimes I think people think access is more difficult because they go into it believing it's more difficult. And I don't know if they ever recover from that. So yeah. Yes? So you think access would be better to start with access? You feel like you have to be here because you don't know much about it? And they'd stay for Excel. Because by then they know I've got some really cool stuff to show them. Because at the beginning of the semester, you guys don't know me from Adam. I could be like trying to trick you into showing up, and I've got nothing important to teach you. Yeah, so his thinking there was similar to the start off with something that not many people are familiar with. It'll get people showing up. How many of you who thought you knew, or still do believe that you knew Excel coming into this class, were a little surprised by absolute and relative cell referencing? That's really common for people to use Excel and to have not really ever learned absolute and relative cell referencing. How many of you already knew about that before you came in? Good. Okay. Any other comments? Yes. If we do go. Oh, absolutely. If we changed up the order of the programs, we would definitely have to modify some of the labs. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Oh, yeah. We'd have to change up some of that too, because otherwise that would be just kind of aggravating. Yeah. That's a really good point. She said it feels like the class is split up, Excel and Access, that by the time the final rolls around, it seems like there's going to be so much that you have to recall that it could be almost impossible. And one suggestion that I would have, and this is probably not the suggestion you all want to hear, but it's definitely the one that I think would be the best suggestion, would be to make sure that Excel doesn't fall too far off your radar screen. And wherever you go, how many of you are going somewhere warm for spring break? So while you're on the beach, whip out your Excel book. Get your course notes book out. You can impress the people walking by with your Excel skills. So you want to make sure that you take every opportunity you can to not forget Excel. Back here. Yeah, we're here for so long. You know what's sad about this? For the past 14 years, the class was an hour and 48 minutes. So 28 minutes longer than the agony you endure already twice a week. Yes, it was long. And the labs were an hour and 48 minutes long as well. So for me, this has been kind of a nice change. I feel like we don't have enough time sometimes. Although today we have a few extra minutes, which is why I'm taking the time to do this. We have tried... Hey, listen, because this is, I'm really asking for your feedback here. We've tried to look at some possibilities for flipping the classroom. That means different things, really, to different people, and it's not one-size-fits-all approach to flipping the classroom. But what I found with you guys at the very beginning of the semester was that I had a very hard time even getting you guys to work on the homework assignments coming into the class, that being able to take some of the more boring stuff out of the lectures, I didn't see how it was going to be helpful at all to any of you. So we are looking for strategies to try to break up the lectures, but we're not finding a whole lot of common ground with what people are coming into class with in terms of the skills to do that. Yeah, go ahead. And that's what we do with the in-class exercises, and with the labs. That's also something where we want you to be working on those problems. But you do have to think about one thing. In order for us to be able to do that, there has to be quite a bit of studying and reading going on coming into that point of doing the practice problems. And that hasn't happened yet. That's what we worry about. I mean, suggestions on that? Any thoughts on that? Because I like your idea. I'm trying to figure out how to implement it. So with the not paying attention thing, how do I combat that? If people come in and they don't pay attention, but it's still important stuff, do I just not cover it? Well, yeah, I mean, logistically, the lab and having a recitation would be difficult, but even the functionality of it. We'd like to build in more in-class exercises. I mean, we'd like to spend a lot more time doing that. But the problem is, those boring lectures are actually for a reason. I mean, have you guys noticed there are times where I'm covering something, and no sooner than I cover it, hands go up, and somebody's asking exactly what I just covered. So the not paying attention thing, that's going to happen. I don't know that I can combat that. There has to be some desire in students to want to listen and learn. Yeah. So have some of the lab stuff be like a handwritten thing. We also don't want to lose. When here's a really important thing. When you're practicing the concepts in Excel, there's this progression that we want you to work through. Lecture, where we give you a lot of information. You guys are smart. I mean, you guys are, you're bright people. That's why you're here. So we give you a lot of the fundamentals and the theory of the functions, and the pre-lab is where you get used to it. You don't have computers in front of you. We can't do one of those things where click here, click here, click here, because that'd be like treating you like you guys were babies. So you learn. Pre-lab is where you practice. In-lab is where you practice and you're timed. And then the practice problems is where you show that you have taken what you understand to a whole different level. And I don't know that we want to lose that hands-on experience either. But, you know, the suggestion that you have would include not getting rid of all of those. So I think there could be some merit to that. What else? Yeah. We would like to have more in-class exercises. If we could do a recitation, I mean, that's what we would do, would be more in-class exercises. But we would be doing that to the detriment of lecture material. So let me ask you this. How many of you, honestly, would prepare more coming in? So we give you less lecture, so there's more you have to do on your own. And then you're expected to come in and already know it and apply it and ask questions. How many of you would do that? I mean, and my guess is the few of you that have your hands up are the same ones that we could throw in a box and give you a book and a flashlight, and you'd be able to take the final exam because you're good, motivated self-learners. You guys would learn anywhere. Any other? Yeah. Longer labs with more things to do? I mean, we could. Everything's a trade-off. Everything's a trade-off. Yeah. Hey, she's talking. You may not like what I'm talking about right now, but this is important. And you've got 4 points extra credit to sit here and listen to it. So calm down. Yeah.
Some of the free labs are like 50 pages for each section, and they have 3 pages, and start reading all of them, and then like you start just doing the instructions. You're not overthinking and actually the text, knowing what it is, and get it done.
Yeah, because there's a lot of stuff. It is. I agree. It is hard when you start working on the pre-labs. There's a lot of reading that you have to do, and it's like that really for all of them. But you have to do it. I mean, there are certain things we can't cut out. I mean, taking a class was never, nobody ever said it was going to be easy or be fun. This class is one that, time and time again, students hate it when they take it. They complain, they whine. Not everybody, but most students complain every step of the way. It's like we're having to drag them, kicking and screaming to learn it. And at the end of the semester and after that, we get so many messages, emails, even students who come in. And you may have even been in my office hours before, and you've seen, how many of you have been in there and seen students from past quarters come in and just plop down in a chair and just start talking? Oh, some of you have been in there. You've been in there. Yeah, I mean, actually people, after they take this class, they look back and they go, man, I'm really glad I did that. I hated it when I took it, but I'm glad I did. Yeah, over here.
I just think that, I don't know, I think it depends on like what kind of learner you are, but for me, like watching something on screen doesn't help me. Like I'd rather do it. I think if we did like a lecture, like one of the days, like weeks, like you did a lecture one day and the next day we did like in-class practice and stuff like that, that would help more because it's easier to like practice by like actually doing things. That's what we have to do for quizzes and that's what we have to do for class.
One of the things I would ask about that is that that's the way the class is designed. You see, and then you go work on the pre-lab. That's your doing.
I think it should be like the more difficult.
I wonder. I mean,
It has nothing to do with the way we teach.
and I'm not taking offense to any of this. I just,
It's just like I think like watching anyone like just have to like explain things to them.
and I wouldn't take offense to that. If I would take offense to that, I wouldn't have started out today telling you about the kid who yelled out, "We hate your class." So I'm not going to take any offense to that. But I wonder how much of this would really play out that way. That's what I worry about. Yeah, right in front of her. Absolutely you do, yeah. How much of this should be you researching your own questions? And the other piece of this would be, how many questions come up because somebody wasn't listening in here? I mean, honestly, the number of people that are still sticking quotes around true and false, I would just like to wring your necks. I must have said 6 or 7 times, don't do it, you'll lose points. So some of the questions that come up, and I'm not saying this would necessarily be the case with you, some of them come up because people aren't listening, but at the same time, we don't want to constantly be answering every single question because part of this is about seeking out the answers. So we don't want to lose that piece of it either. Yeah. So you're feeling like there's a good balance. But one thing I want to ask, because we're getting short on time, how many of you, either you have been told this by past teachers or principals, or you've just kind of grown up feeling like in a class, if the material cannot be presented in a manner in which sparks your interest, then it's not your fault if you don't want to learn it? Nobody's been told that at all. Because I have had students that have said that. And we run into some difficulty with presenting material. There are just things we have to teach you that, well, God, they're just boring. I can't spice it up no matter what I do. And that's sometimes what happens with the lectures. So tell me, you guys have been extremely quiet the entire semester. What would get you talking? To me, not to each other. I know how to do that. I didn't hear that. What'd you say? Pizza. Oh, yes, pizza. That's not going to happen. I don't get paid enough for pizza. Maybe chocolate, but I don't know that that would work. Yeah. Participation points for your participation instead of your attendance. And I don't know how I would do that, because I would have some students who would participate. How do we track that? I mean, the other thing is, you don't get points for attendance unless it's extra credit. That attendance that we take every class, I look at it. I check the attendance book all the time, but there's no place in the syllabus for grades based on attendance. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to, but we sure like to know who's showing up and who doesn't. But it would be hard to track. And it would, I don't know how fair it would be. Like you in the front row or second row, I'd be more likely to see you, but then the people in the back, I don't know. Hunter? Listen to this, Hal. Talking to you. Talk to the teacher or talk to the other students? So keeping track of it. How many of you would be offended if I asked you to wear a name tag? That's not funny. Hey, wait a minute. How many of you would be that annoyed if when you ask a question I say, yes, David, ask your question? I mean, I could say your name. Doesn't this feel kind of impersonal? I mean, I actually hate the fact that I can't learn all your names. And I'm afraid to start learning names because then over break, if I forget them, I'm going to offend you even more if I come in and I can't remember your name because I knew it before. Yeah. Yeah, clickers. Hey, he's talking about clickers. How easy is it for somebody to take somebody else's clicker with them to class? Oh, yeah, I mean, signing the name thing is also not all that reliable. But you've seen it work in your biology class. Over here? What'd you say? So the class size sometimes impedes. Hey, it is not time to leave yet. I still have 4 more minutes. And I expect you to wait until I dismiss you. Thank you. This is important. This is one of the most important classes we've had, at least in my opinion. So buckle down for a minute. So she's saying sometimes it's very, very difficult to ask questions in a big class like this. And that might be one of the reasons. Oh, So does it seem like it's inconveniencing me if you ask a question like you're stopping me? Who's flicking the pen? I'm sure it's unconscious, but please don't do that. Go ahead. It can be intimidating. Okay, back here. If needed, yeah, she's asking about the curve. Yeah, if needed, at the end of the semester, when I look at, so this wouldn't be a test, an individual test sort of thing. It'd be looking at the overall distribution at the end of the semester. And yeah, if that distribution is low, absolutely I would curve it. I try not to do that by giving extra credit. But even after the extra credit, and I need to do it, I will. It doesn't happen all that often. As much as people complain about the class, it usually ends up being a pretty good average. I mean, you guys had it was like a 70-something average on the midterm. So that's pretty good. Yeah, back here. One of the lab assignments as a written portion? Something you'd already seen before? Well, the reason why we don't use some of those other examples for the test is because we don't want people memorizing strategies. We want you to be able to apply what you've learned to any problem, every problem that you see, any and every. Now, I want to ask you a question. Why the heck do you think I've just taken so much time to talk about this? I mean, part of it is to get ideas, but there's another reason why I just took 20 minutes to do this. Why do you think it is? I was tired of talking about access. Actually, I love access, and I talk about it every chance I can get. But no, you guys were restless, and it's almost spring break, and I lost you about 15 minutes before I started talking about that. Why do you think I did this? How many of you started out this class thinking, why do they teach it like this? Why don't they do it like this? Why don't they do it like this? It'd be so much better if they did it like this. I can't learn because they're doing it like this. How many of you felt that way? A lot of you. And so your concerns, I can hear, and I can explain to you on some level why we can't do it that way. While we are still trying to explore new ways to flip things around, I'm not saying we'll never be able to do things a certain way, but I've also been able to explain to you some of the challenges we face in trying to implement the strategies that you've all, in some way or another, felt or expressed or maybe even believed was a hurdle right in front of you, keeping you from learning in this class. That's one of the reasons why I did it. Because every time I walk in here,